I can promise you that if you are not throwing a spinnerbait during the fall, you are truly missing out. This is one of the best baits to not only catch numbers of fish during this time of year, but also to catch really, really big fish. And in today's video, I want to give you 5 tips that I think will help you to maximize your fall spinnerbait fishing. So stay tuned, it's going to be a good one. Now, before we get into the video, I wanted to let you guys know that my bass hats are currently 20% off on the website. This is an extremely unique hat made with a wooden bass badge made from a bourbon barrel. So if you guys are on the market for a hat, right now is the best time to buy. I've got some snapbacks, I've got some flex fits. I'm also selling my new tri-blend t-shirts for 20% off right now, just until the end of this week. So if you guys would like to help support the Bass Fishing HQ channel, click on those links below for fin fishing. There's no doubt that a spinnerbait can be a very good tool for an angler all year long. I mean, you can catch bass in the spring, summer, fall, even during the winter with a spinnerbait. But to me, when I think of fall fishing, one of the first baits that comes to mind is a spinnerbait. To me, it has been very dominant. It's a bait that if you can get on this bite, you're going to catch a ton of fish. You're going to catch some really big fish on the bodies of water that you fish, whether that's a pond, a lake, a river, no matter what it is. And so that's why I really wanted to talk about it and be very specific about fall time fishing. Now, one of the biggest reasons that a spinnerbait works so well in the fall is that it mimics a bait fish extremely well. And during the fall, the bass know that winter is coming and they do tend to feed up. You do tend to have a fall feed. It's not like bass go into hibernation like a bear during the winter. They will still bite, but because their metabolism starts to slow down in that cold water, they will feed up a little bit more aggressively during the fall. And what I have seen kind of in across the nation, but definitely in the part of the country that I live, is that when those water temps start to dip down into the like low 60s and definitely anywhere in the 50-degree range, that is when this spinnerbait bite is the best. And so if you are facing some of those conditions on the body of water that you are fish, it is time to pick up a spinnerbait. And now I want to go through 5 big tips, 5 things that really help me to just maximize my fall time spinnerbaits. Now, the first thing that you're going to want to do with your fall spinnerbaits is make sure you are setting your bait up for success. This is something that if you are new to spinnerbait fishing, I think it's going to be very critical for you. If you have been fishing a spinnerbait for a number of years, you probably already know a lot of this, but hey, it's a great reminder. But one thing that I have found, when you get a spinnerbait out of the package, it's really not ready to go. Sure, you could throw that bait out there and you could catch some fish and things are going to be good, but to really maximize the bites that you get and to connect with more fish that hit that bait, you really want to set your bait up for success. So right here, I have it's actually a Berkley spinnerbait. This is a spinnerbait that I've really grown fond of over just the last year. And the biggest reason that I like this particular spinnerbait is that the hook, the main hook of this bait, actually sits a little bit further back from the head of the bait than most spinnerbaits you will see on the market. Now, that hook sitting a little bit further back on the bait, I really feel like it just simply allows you to catch more fish that bite the spinnerbait. And I'm a guy who doesn't tend to like to use a trailer hook with my spinnerbaits, and we're going to get to that in just a minute here. The other thing that I really like about this particular spinnerbait is it has a great bait keeper on it. There's so many baits that I use super glue with my bladed jigs, spinnerbaits, jigs, anything I'm feeding a plastic up onto, a lot of times I'm going to use super glue. Now, this Berkley bait keeper, they have it on a lot of the Berkley products, and I'm not sponsored by Berkley in any means. I mean, this bait that I'm showing right now actually has a rusty hook on it. But what I found about this particular bait keeper is it's probably the best in the market, in my opinion, on keeping a plastic bait up on your hook without using super glue. Now, getting back to setting the bait up for success, the biggest thing that I want to do with this bait is simply trim the skirt. A lot of skirts that you get from almost every manufacturer out there are actually pretty long. I like to trim my spinnerbait skirt just below the hook of this bait. So literally it's the same thing that I actually do a lot of times when I'm fishing a jig. Now, the reason that I do this is because if you have a really long skirt, they could also come up and hit the end of that skirt where they're not going to get that main hook. So trimming that skirt up, if they're gonna hit that skirt now, they're going to get a hook. Now, the second thing that I really like to do with a spinnerbait is I am going to add some sort of plastic trailer to the bait. This is something that I think is extremely important, and I'll tell you the reason in just a minute, but before I do that, I'm gonna show you real quick what I do. One of my favorite trailers that I like to use is just a simple 3.3 inch Kitech. I really like that size. It's not too big, it's not too small. If you have a lot of big fish in your body of water, you can use a lot bigger Kitech. You can use a 4.8, even a 5.8. To me, this is like a perfect all-around size, kind of that 3.3. I've also used a Zoom Fat Albert a lot in the past. It's a simple grub trailer. Now, you don't necessarily even need to use a trailer that has some sort of action like a boot tail swim bait or a grub to it. Really, the main purpose of that trailer is to add a little bit of volume to that skirt so that when that bass goes to actually inhale that bait, it has something to suck in to its mouth. This is something that I find to be extremely important. And for those of you guys that don't know, I used to do tree work for a living, right? I used to cut down trees. I did it for like 10 years of my life. It's very, very hard work. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is that there's a very interesting parallel when it comes to the skirt of a spinnerbait with a trailer and tree work. During the middle of winter around where I live, all your trees lose their leaves, right? They lose their sail. They lose their foliage, right? And when you have big windstorms coming through in the middle of winter, that wind will push against a tree, but that wind just goes right through the tree, right? Because there's nothing grabbing that wind. When you have that same windstorm during the middle of summer, it has something to grab. That wind doesn't just hit that tree, it hits those leaves, and those leaves will actually cause major branches to fall over, to land on cars, to land on houses, and that's where we do a lot of work. Now, with that being said, with a spinnerbait, what you are doing by adding that trailer is you are adding sail. You are adding foliage to that bait. When a bass goes to inhale a bait, what they do is they create negative pressure in their mouth. So when they open their mouth, it's basically like a current that flows into their mouth. It's like the wind. If there is nothing for that current to kind of grab onto, to really suck into that bass's mouth, it is not going to inhale that bait very well. And so adding a simple piece of plastic to your spinnerbait provides that volume, that sail, that foliage that really allows that current to grab onto something and draw it into a bass's mouth. So if there is no plastic on that bait and a bass goes to inhale it, it's kind of like the wind moving through those trees in the winter. There's nothing to grab on. There's nothing for that wind to grab onto. So sometimes that prevents you from hooking up with that fish. Now, what some guys have done is they use a trailer hook. And a trailer hook, I used to use one for a long, long time. They work really well. But what I have found, and what I did find out after using a trailer hook for years, is one, you're going to get hung a lot more often if you're using a trailer hook. And when I am fishing this bait in the fall, I am throwing this in some heavy, heavy cover. And so I don't like to have that trailer hook because I get hung too much with it. Now, the other thing is that it seems like when the bass get hooked up with a spinnerbait with a trailer hook, they always have just the trailer hook. It seems like that trailer hook sometimes prevents that bass from getting the main hook. And so that's why I prefer to use just a trailer. Now, some of you guys are going to argue against that, and that's 100% fine. This is just what I have seen to work for me. If something else works for you, then you do you. Now, the last thing when it comes to setting your spinnerbait up that I want to talk about are the blades themselves. There's a ton of different blade configurations out there on the market. I really like to make this pretty simple for me. If I'm fishing in pretty muddy water, I'm going to go with double Colorado blades. I'm going to have two different Colorado blades or Indiana blades. Both of those blades put out a lot of vibration. Now, if I'm fishing in kind of stained water, but maybe you have a foot or 2 or 3 foot of visibility, I'm going to go with a small Colorado blade and a bigger willow leaf blade. I kind of have the best of both worlds there. Now, if I'm fishing in pretty clear water, I'd say 3-4 foot plus, I'm going to go with a double willow blade combo. Now, speaking of water clarity, this brings me to tip number 2, and this isn't always true. But what I have found is that your best fall time spinnerbait fishing is typically done in muddy or really off-color water. And this is something that I specifically go out and look for. And it's not necessarily that the bass won't eat a spinnerbait in cleaner or clear water, but I personally think that they will hit other baits a little bit better. So when I get to the body of water that I'm fishing, I oftentimes will simply look for muddy or really off color water. And you actually will have this a lot of times up creek arms. There might just be sections of lakes for whatever reason that are a little bit more off color. Usually up the river on major reservoirs is a little bit more off color. And one of the big things that dirty water does is it simply pushes bass up into cover. When you have really clear water, those fish can roam a little bit more, right? Their eyesight's better. They tend to roam a little bit more. When that water is really muddy, it kind of more or less positions the fish really tight to cover. So therefore, you're going to be throwing this bait right next and right into cover. Now that actually brings me to my third point here, which is put this bait in the nastiness. The big thing that I like to find is muddy water and a lot of wood cover, stumps, laydowns, logs. I like to put this bait right up in the junk. And the big thing that I'm going to do with this bait is I'm going to constantly hit it off the wood. I'm going to hit it off the wood. I'm going to kill it. And if I'm not hitting the wood, something that I also like to do is simply twitch this blade. I like to make those blades kind of just flare out, because if a fish is kind of tracking this bait and those blades flare out, a lot of times that is a trigger for the fish to commit to that bait. The big thing that I'm getting at here is you don't want to just cast this bait out and just reel it back. Sure, if you find a dumb bass, he's going to bite it if you're just casting it out and reeling it back. But if you want to up your game, if you want to catch a lot more fish than the average guy, hit it against cover, pop your blade, let it drop, and you're going to catch a lot more fish because you're going to trigger a lot more fish. Now, the fourth tip that I find to be extremely critical in the fall is make sure you have your bait in the right water column. I think a big mistake that we can make during the fall is fishing our baits below the bass. And a lot of times, because the bait are so ready to eat bait fish during this time of the year, I think that they're looking up. And I feel like you will catch a lot more fish if you're keeping that bait above them. Now, if you're fishing maybe some standing timber and the fish are suspended on it, you don't want that bait to come below those fish. You want to keep that bait above the fish. But this is something that changes from day to day and from body of water to body of water. You will find days where the bass want that bait really high in the water column. You will find days where the bass want it kind of in the middle of the water column. And especially when you get really late into fall and that water temperatures in the low 50s, upper 40s, you will find that those bass want that bait actually hitting the bottom, because those bass are going to be right there on the bottom. They're not going to be moving a whole lot. So you got to kind of position it right in front of their face. So this is just something that you need to experiment with, but make sure you're just paying attention to when you get bit, where was that fish in the water column? Was he down low? Was he up high? Because that will help you to get a lot more bites when you understand the water column that the fish are sitting. Now, tip number 5 actually is knowing when to put the spinnerbait down. I think that this is really important. It's something that I learned several years back. I was fishing a lake that had some recent rains during the fall. I was catching a ton of fish on a spinnerbait. I went back like 4 or 5 days later and the water had cleaned up pretty significantly. It went from having water that was about a half a foot to 1 foot of visibility to about 4 foot in visibility. And those fish were actually still in that area, but I could not get them to bite a spinnerbait. I would have some follows from time to time on that bait. Now, in that situation, what I ended up doing is picking up one of my favorite baits of all time, which is a Mega Bass Mag Draft swim bait. Now, this is the 6-inch version. It's one of the best baits out there on the market. And I did a full video all about this particular bait that I'm going to leave linked right up here in the corner. This is just a great bait to use, again, in clear water, or if those bass are just following that spinnerbait or not getting it. So if you want to learn more about the mag draft and when to fish it, go ahead and click right here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.